Welcome to History Secrets Uncovered. My name is Jay Chandrana, and today I have the privilege of speaking with Professor Samuel Redman, a historian at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and director at the Public History Program. Professor Redman's work explores how museums, scientific institutions, and collectors have shaped the way history is preserved and presented to the public. His research reveals how institutions that many of us see as neutral spaces of knowledge are deeply connected to questions of power, race, and memory. In today's conversation, we'll explore how museums have shaped historical narratives, how scientific collecting was tied to broader social hierarchies, and what it means to study history in institutions that both preserve and construct the past. Professor Redman, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, what a pleasure. Thanks for asking me to talk to you.
Of course, and to start, what first drew you to studying museums and history of collecting?
Yeah, this is such a great question. And historians love to talk about origins, like how things got started, just in general. And sometimes that involves our own lives. And, there are probably a couple of different possible answers to that. I grew up going to museums, like a lot of folks, probably not really thinking about it all that much. That what we see at any given museum that we go to is like scratching the surface of what museums tend to have, especially larger museums. You're seeing about 1% of their collection at any given time that's on exhibit. But flashing forward a little bit to something that I think would be more interesting in terms of answering this question for this type of an audience is that when I was 18, I went off to college and was picking my classes for the first time. And I thought, oh, archaeology, that sounds kind of interesting. I went to a small college and they didn't have an archaeology program. So the next best thing was studying a field called anthropology, which sort of modestly aims to study all of humanity and all of culture across all of time and space. It's like a big field.
Yeah.
But what's so great about anthropology is that it allows you to ask lots of different questions about culture. And then from there, I had an internship at the Field Museum in Chicago, which is one of the largest natural history museums in the country.
Yeah.
And I became really interested in the history of that place and how those collections came to be. So that really set me off on this journey in terms of studying the history of museums. I'll start with that and we could keep going.
Yeah, and when most people walk into a museum, they assume that they're entering a space of objective and unbiased knowledge. From your perspective, what does that assumption miss, or what does it get right?
Great question. So, these institutions like museums and universities, of course, a lot of people listening to this will know that if you look at the longer history or sort of the longer durée of any of those institutions, that oftentimes there's a lot of problematic history that's connected and attached to those things. The way we learn about science in general, the way I learned about science in my sort of ninth grade biology class is that there's this thing called the scientific method, and you sort of go through this process, and it's sort of naturally presented to you as this unbiased thing, this like process that where we test and verify and test a hypothesis and come up with a theory and so forth. But historians will tell you, so a whole field of history of science, historians will tell you that history is not at all, or sorry, science rather, is not at all divorced from culture, or it's not at all divorced from the way humans have their own perspectives and
Sure, yeah.
biases. So the way in which we've thought about things that are seemingly neutral have in fact been really shaped by humanity over the course of history. So an example, like just, that might surprise a lot of people, the way in which we know a lot about butterflies is because, frankly, British slave ships that were going around the world had naturalists on board that were collecting butterflies from around the world. And they brought back these materials to London and studied them. But they were collecting specifically in areas where they could capture slaves. So
Yeah.
it colors the way in which we thought about butterflies in the 19th and 20th century. So something that we might think would be sort of value neutral in that way is actually deeply intertwined with human history and human culture.
That's super interesting. And kind of off of that, a big part of what makes human culture human is religion. And just going to ask you if you know it off the top of your head or anything, are there certain museums out there that are kind of entrenched in religion and have almost pushed forth like a religious standpoint, a religious belief, and had to retract that to be a more unbiased source of knowledge.
Yeah. Well, so it's an interesting question. So we'll get into the project that becomes my first book, which is about the history of collecting human remains in particular. And one of the things that I had to think about in starting that book project, and this sounds kind of, I don't know, it sounds sort of a curious thought process, but anytime you're writing a project about history, you have to think about some of the boundaries, right, of what it is you're writing about and what it is you're not writing about.
Yeah,
So I became interested in all of these instances where people were collecting human remains. And in particular, what I ended up becoming interested in is when they came to these large museums like the Field Museum that I mentioned, or the Smithsonian or American Museum of Natural History in New York. But there are all these other instances, like in the catacombs in Europe, throughout many of cities in Europe that where remains were collected and displayed in a more religious context. And so I had to ask myself, like, well, what is an exhibit of human remains? And when is it sort of this like religious phenomenon that might relate to the Catholic tradition or another sort of religious tradition? And when is it under the veneer of science? And what makes it different if we're walking into a museum space and looking at a mummy versus if we're walking into a Catholic church and we see a selection of their remains that's on display in that church. Like they're both displays of human remains, but ostensibly they're presented in different sorts of ways. So part of what's interesting to me is like kind of pulling that back a little bit and asking questions about like, well, why is that? Like, why do we even do that to begin with? And seeking a historical answer for that.
and you just said that collecting these bones, collecting these remains, were under the veneer of scientific work. In bone rooms, what did collectors believe they were doing, and how did they kind of justify this?
Yeah, such a great question. So in some ways, it's kind of interesting, or it makes sense to start from the end and sort of think about it almost in reverse.
Sure.
So the thing that I think shocked me and shocks a lot of people that learn this fact is that the Smithsonian Institution has in its collection more than 30,000 sets of human remains.
Really?
So my question pretty simply became, why and
That's a
how?
good question. Yeah.
Like how did that happen? And why don't we know that? Why is it that maybe when you go to the Smithsonian, you see the ruby red slippers from Wizard of Oz, you see the Star Spangled Banner, you see great natural history collections, but you don't necessarily know that they have this large collection, one of the largest in the world, in fact, of human remains. And the deeper history behind that is, in fact, quite troubling, where scientists between the 19th and early 20th century were deeply committed to understanding ideas that they believed were very true about race and human difference. And they believed that through careful scientific study and measurement, that they could determine the not only the existence of different types of races, but the way in which many white curators thought about this was through a idea of human hierarchy or human difference that always put white men on the top of that hierarchy. And frankly, very often put African Americans or people from Africa in terms of we're collecting from directly from Africa, and then also Native Americans lower on that apparent hierarchy. But the idea that they could parse out and determine human difference motivated a huge number of collectors. So both these scientists, these curators, but also a huge number of other people, medical officers, military folks with the Army and Navy, curious, interested amateurs, farmers. Many people were willing to collect human remains and send them to the Smithsonian Institution. So that became the story that I was interested in trying to tell.
Got it. And we see this kind of shift we were just talking about, the Scopes trial, for example, in American history, and um, like Darwinism, but like not evolution. It's this
Yeah.
racist tendencies. And I think that idea of how historians and specifically museums might have played a role in propagating that is a super interesting one, and I think it's important to understand that there is a point in our history where evolution and social Darwinism were thought of as the same thing, and there's American history that kind of backs that up as well.
Yeah, and what's interesting to me is that there's a great expression that is sort of shorthand where sometimes people will say the past is a foreign country, where going back and sort of thinking about these different perspectives are so sometimes strange and weird in that it's almost like going to a completely different place. And
Yeah,
thinking about actually the era of the Scopes trial and ideas about race and evolution, that's a perfect sort of moment to encapsulate because frankly, a lot of people that we would sort of think of as liberal or left or advanced in their thinking were deeply bought into the idea of racial categories
yeah,
or
exactly.
deeply bought into different views of evolution. And in fact, often why folks were quite critical of ideas about the way in which ideas in the 1920s were presented about evolution were often really linked to social Darwinism, as you said, in ways that Darwin never really intended.
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
all of this is to say that in addition to it playing out in educational spaces like the Scopes trial, at that same moment, all of these same questions are playing out in museum exhibits. And those museum exhibits are super popular in this era. So in 1915, the San Diego Museum of Man opens the largest exhibit of human remains and the story of human evolution to that point, and thousands of people go to that exhibit. And it's also written about in newspapers and magazines and on the radio. So maybe not quite the same way that people might learn about an exhibit today on TikTok or Instagram or online, but there's a certain level of viral nature of sort of this spreading around in that era. But a lot of this is really connected to debates that people are having about race and human history at that exact time.
Yeah, and kind of moving on to another one of your works, in Prophets and Ghosts, you explored the idea of salvage anthropology, and you touched on Native Americans earlier, and I think they're a good example of this, which was the idea that like certain cultures were disappearing and they needed to be preserved. What was what was the mindset behind that idea?
Yeah. So there's kind of a couple of different interesting ways to look and think about that. A lot of my Native American friends will point out rightly, they'll say, wow, this idea was really wrong. It was really wrong-headed. We're still here, in fact.
Yeah,
That Native people are still here and they have vibrant cultures and that they did not, in fact, disappear. But in the 19th century, at the turn of the century, in fact, on some to some degree, it was a pretty reasonable point of view to see the rapid genocide and disease and attrition of native cultures and think, wow, these cultures are under threat. They're under duress. That the languages that they had, the cultural traditions, their traditions in making things, were on their way to extinction. And so, in response to that, a huge number of people, anthropologists like those folks that we talked about earlier, but also missionaries, um, again, army officers, medical officers, people who were just sort of curious about this sort of thing, would collect materials from those native cultures that they thought were threatened and try to preserve them in museums. And it leaves with us like this really mixed legacy because, on the one hand, it's very problematic. It looks at native people as very backward looking or sort of encased in amber as like historical museum objects. And on the other hand, as many of my native friends will tell you, they're really glad that some of these things were preserved, right? That they could do language revitalization classes or art classes that are based on objects that were, in some cases taken 100 years ago. So there's a lot of things to sort of think about and sort through with that, right? Like how do we return objects that should go home? How do we properly display objects and teach people about them and foreground native voice? Because so frequently in the story, it's been European Americans or people that look like me, frankly, who've been allowed to tell the story. So how do we sort of think about that in a different set of ways?
yeah, and I think that point about Native Americans especially is super compelling and interesting. Um, and the first example that comes to my mind is boarding schools, right?
Yeah.
And I remember I was reading this document about specifically native hair, and Native Americans like to keep their hair a certain way, and in these boarding schools, young women would have to get their hair cut off, and I think obviously it's a little different than your work, and it's not exploring exact like artifacts, but it's kind of stripping away of native culture and like an effort of assimilation is is a trend that we see over and over again in American history and European history in general as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that's such a great example. And again, another thing that I really didn't learn much about until I went to college. And then I went to college at a school that had been a Native American boarding school.
Oh,
And wow, just like looking around the campus and encountering other Native people from the Dakotas and Minnesota and elsewhere around the Midwest who knew more about that history than I did, right? Because their grandparents had told them about it and so forth. And so, wow, that was a real eye-opening educational experience. And to understand that, in that same moment in time, and we can think about sort of the legacy of these things, that there were anthropologists who were stealing things from Native people
yeah.
and in that same moment, there were other anthropologists or other curators who were doing things more collaboratively. Like there's an example that I write about in Prophets and Ghosts where if you know of a teepee or a lodge that Plains Indians would use as their home, that there would be traditionally a buffalo hide that would go around this. And the Kiowa people would believe that your teepee cover was specific to your home, specific to your family, and maybe that would come to you in a vision or a dream. But it was like proprietary, right? That if you stole the designs from someone else's teepee cover, that's like plagiarism, right? Like
Yeah.
that's stealing. But James Mooney is an anthropologist. He becomes interested in this and he understands that the teepee cover itself he can't take. Like that is their specific design. But what he does is there's this new thing called the Sears and Roebuck catalog. It's like ordering stuff off of Amazon today. And he orders deer skins that are made in a factory in Chicago and sends them out to the Kiowa community and he invites people to make an exact replica of their deerskin cover or their buffalo hide cover in a smaller version. And he makes a miniature village, like a model village of
That's
this.
super cool.
And it's
Yeah.
only been displayed a couple of times publicly, but all of them are photographed and like freely available on the internet. Like you can look at and, zoom really into these like 4K scans of this model Kiowa village. So that is to say, history is complicated. And we learn about these different examples that are deeply troubling in the modern day. And there are also some examples that are more collaborative and inspiring. And I think people who don't really seriously study history, sometimes they have trouble with that. They want to see things as black and white or good and bad. And there's also some nuance and some gray area and things that are complicated and sometimes make us turn things over in our mind. So I'm more interested in those types of cultural dynamics and stories. And to me, they're pretty revealing in terms of what they tell us about who we are today.
Yeah, definitely. And I think kind of on that note, a lot of museums today are starting to rethink collections, especially around, like you mentioned, human remains and repatriation. How specifically are these institutions trying to address these past practices and confront that gray area without leaning too much on one side or the other?
Yes. So in 1990, a new law passed called the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, or NAGPRA. And that gave tribes a vehicle to demand the return of their ancestors that were, frankly, and many of them on museum shelves. We talked about those 30,000 sets of human remains.
Yeah.
University of California had another 15,000. University of Michigan, Minnesota, Texas. I mean, you name it. They're sort of all over the country. Harvard had another, 22,000 sets of remains. So this large problem that I think not a lot of people fully knew about. But it took a lot of time and research and pulling these puzzle pieces together and detective work, right? Because according to the law, you had to essentially prove that the remains that were on that museum shelf were your ancestor, that they're connected to you in some way.
Yeah.
Complicating matters too, DNA, a lot of people will just, if you're telling someone this, on an airplane and they're asking you what you do, they'll say, well, why don't we just do DNA analysis? Well, DNA analysis involves destroying some bit of those remains. It involves
Mm,
burning, a sample of those remains in order to do analysis of the material. And for a lot of people, not just Native Americans, that runs against cultural norms of death and burial, right?
yeah.
Burning remains. So, yeah, some people, though, are really amenable to different types of analysis and scientific research and things like that. I think the big shift is who gets to decide, right? Before 1990, the entire weight of the decision was on these institutions. Harvard, Smithsonian, they got to call the shots. And
Yeah.
now, at least to some extent, we're engaging in a little bit more of a dialogue. I think we still need to go a long way in building those bridges. Only 30% of eligible remains have gone home thus far, and we're now
Really?
30 years into this law. So we still have a really long way to go, but there has been some progress.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting. I would have assumed that it would have been more than 30%, but especially with how difficult it must be to kind of get that sorted out. I mean, there's no telling how far these remains could have traveled over like the years since they've been collected. It might have
For sure.
started off in like the Dakotas, but ended up overseas in Europe. It's really probably a very difficult process to track down.
Absolutely. And I think, it's kind of interesting to pitch to people who are listening to this. Like it will be people who are listening to this who are lawyers or historical researchers or people working in politics who will be addressing this and thinking about this in
Yeah,
terms of like the law that I mentioned only covers remains in the United States, right? Covered in the United States. So what about remains, just like you said, that were uncovered in Canada and brought to a museum in Berlin? I mean, that story's repeated 1,000 times, right? That
of
there
course.
was, intensive collecting happening in places like Colorado, but also British Columbia, right? So, in some ways, why should our current national borders determine our ethical future, right? Or our or sort of moral futures. So there's needs to be more creative thinking and thinking about that, but all of the present day reality relates to this history. So I think in order to be a successful lawyer or a politician or diplomat dealing with this, you have to have some knowledge of how we got here.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's super insightful. And kind of moving on a little bit, how do museums balance scientific research with ethical responsibility, especially when these communities are involved?
That's a great, like, that's $1 million question. And
Thank
I
you.
will say that I've had really important, I think, behind the scenes conversations with really smart people who are thinking about that, and there's no sort of easy answer. But I will say, in referencing, there's a movement and a number of scholars and a great book that's an example of this called Decolonizing Museums by a native scholar named Amy Lonetree, where a lot of the focus of that book is thinking about how can we both at large and small museums that are maybe within these communities, right? That on some level they're serving a public facing mission, and on some level they're for the communities themselves. How do we, instead of privileging sort of this top down scientific voice of the expert, right, who's sort of documentary style telling you about another culture, how do we instead hear from the people themselves, right? How
Yeah,
do we instead, see it in that way and think about it, this sort of representation that's taking space in those places in a different sort of way. And that's something I think a lot of people and museum visitors are more alive to than ever and curious about. But again, we still have a long way to go if we think about that a lot of these museums were set up in the late 19th century, more than 100 years ago. So even, there's just a long legacy of collecting and setting up the sort of legacy of these institutions and exhibits that need to be updated and rethought. But yeah, I guess a big million dollar question here is who gets to decide? Who
Yeah,
gets
and
to, who's the sort of author of the story that we're reading, be it in a documentary film or a TikTok that we watch or a museum exhibit, like we need to consistently be thinking like who's the author here and what are they trying to tell me?
I do think that kind of what you mentioned about TikTok is interesting because social media and kind of more modern forms of media have really allowed for people's voices who wouldn't typically have been heard to be propagated. And I think in that way, social media has been probably a big success on kind of rectifying that balance a bit on who's telling the story.
Yeah, sure. And that's right. And it's not just then one voice. I mean, we talk about how there were fewer channels, not just on television, but in terms of radio and in terms of media overall, that, there are sort of fewer sources of information.
Yeah.
But yeah, just circling back to the some of the core question here is about things like human remains or rare artifacts that were brought from far away. Suffice it to say, people 100 years ago, much like frankly a lot of people today, found that interesting. And
Yeah.
they found it compelling to go out and seek it out and then tell other people about it. So comparably, you'll see there's sort of a turn, I think, in terms of a lot of folks that I know or students that I talk to now, where a number of people are in some ways kind of bored with social media or bored with certain types of experiences, and they want to sort of like do analog stuff. So you'll see people who aren't necessarily in, I live in New England. So you'll see
Yeah.
people who aren't necessarily into this be like, let's go apple picking or like, let's go on a hike. And they
Yeah. Yeah.
want to do things that are really analog, but then maybe they'll tie that experience to storytelling, digital storytelling. And I see museums in some ways as connecting with that, right? Where it's something real, it's physical, you can see it, it's experiential. You go somewhere, you do something, you're more likely to have different interesting conversations than let's say, I always thought a boring first date, frankly, was a movie. Like you just go kind of sit there, like, okay, whatever. But maybe you
Yeah.
talk about it afterwards. And a museum is sort of like that on some level. You see a lot of people engaging with one another in that way. So I don't know. I think that it's valuable to think about sort of the organic experiences we can have.
Yeah, and kind of about museums in generally. What do you think that students and younger audiences, people around my age, misunderstand about how history is presented in museums?
Such a great question. So I think first of all, I don't want to be overly critical about museums as I'm going to make a critical sort of set of
Yeah.
statements.
Yeah.
But because I think people should go to museums, but I think folks should put on their critical thinking hat when they are in museums and try to work the muscles of their brain and ask themselves, for instance, how did this get here? And in some cases, it could be the British Museum and the Elgin marbles, and there could be a really salacious, controversial, problematic, and revealing story connected to that. Or in some cases, the story is much more mundane. In some cases, the artist wanted that piece to be there and donated it. But maybe that could cause us to think differently about how we look at those objects, how we think about them. And then maybe that causes us to think, oh, context is really important, right? And that these things aren't inert. And maybe a lot of life is like that, that there are objects, but then the stories kind of behind them or the things behind the thing that we see are quite revealing. So another sort of left field example is like a highway on some level looks like inert, like it's a road. But if that road displaced a lot of people that live there when it was first being built, that's not a neutral object, right? So I think in terms of looking critically at museums and looking beyond kind of what we're presented, we can start to think more deeply about all of the world and all of the things that we sort of take for granted around us. So that to me is what's interesting about history is we learn to think in a different way. Sometimes we call it thinking historically, right? And so how can we learn not just to think about museums in that way, but all of the different things that we encounter on a day-to-day basis?
I think that's super important and true. I think what you said, context is important, is it's everything, right? Like just the way we interact with the world about us. I think asking that question, asking how did this get here? How did we get to this point? I think that's probably one of the most important things to for any audience to be left with.
Absolutely. And there's, like we were talking about a couple of minutes ago, maybe before we started the recording, but like we think of things like medicine on some level as being neutral in that way.
Yes.
But in fact, if then you start to think historically, not just about museums, but these other sort of institutions or other sort of cultural phenomenon, then you're like, oh wow, the way in which hospitals are set up is specific and sometimes a response to ways in which that it used to be, or sort of thinking about how these things have evolved can sort of change how we might imagine them. But it also then could potentially help us imagine different futures, right? I
Yeah.
think, but suffice it to say, we always have to answer the so what question. And I don't mean to sound glib or like dismissive, but there are certain things that are interesting, like, I don't know, what color dress a certain queen wore on a certain date. Like, okay, it's interesting, but what does it tell us about fashion or trends or femininity or class, or labor? Like, there are all sorts of things that maybe they can be more revealing if we take a deeper look. And like we were saying, to add a context to it. So I guess to me, what's exciting is that people that are about the age that listen to the podcast, you tend to start to see the world in different sorts of ways. And that can be informed by great teachers that you have, but also it can sort of become a manner of thinking or sort of habits of mind that can change your life in really meaningful sorts of ways. So I encourage people to think deeply, and maybe it'll be revealing or maybe it'll be an exercise, but probably they'll learn something about themselves in the process.
Great, thank you. I really appreciate that. And that was my last question. And I really appreciate you taking your time and agreeing to speak with me. I know we
Hey,
just set this up
absolutely. This was
yesterday,
a
so
fun, enjoyable conversation, and I enjoyed it.